Well, what's up, beginner guys? Brian here to do 3 topics camera hitters here. If you know, one of my worst best ranking videos. Now, there hasn't been much news about this, but since those of us that do keep track of, certain movies, we do know that a new live-action Transformers film will be coming out in the near future, mainly set around the Beast Wars era, and that just so happened to be the era of Transformers that I started watching when I was a kid, so I am quite interested. So, just to have a little bit of fun, I sent out a bunch of requests, and some of you really would like to know my personal ranking of the primary 6 live-action Transformers films. Now, most of them are not all that great, some are awful, and few of them are quite acceptable. So I figured I'd share my personal ranking going from worst to best, and see how it plays out. Now, like always, if you do happen to enjoy this little ranking video of mine, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Keep track of me in all my future videos. And if you have any more ideas you would like to see for future rankings, make sure you share those ideas in the comments down below as well. So without wasting any more time, let's start off with number 6, and without question, the worst Transformers live-action film of all time. Okay, starting off with number 6, without question, has to go to 2009's Transformers Revenge of the Fallen. Okay, look, I fairly enjoyed the first Transformers film, and I acknowledge that there were definitely some problems with that film, that because it was the first film, I was able to overlook that. But once you take those same problems and add them in this film, and they get cranked up to an 11, just almost practically nothing about this film works at all. I mean, there's only 2 things, quite literally, that I genuinely enjoyed about this film. One, that it is connected to one of my favorite Linkin Park songs of all time, and like the first 5 minutes, that first action set piece in the first beginning of this film was actually pretty good. Once that scene is over, nothing about this film works. It falls to a bottomless pit, and it never resurges ever. Everything about this film past that point didn't work. The action set pieces didn't work, the interaction with the humans didn't work, even the villains. Somehow you managed to mess up the villains and the Autobots and the Transformers. I mean, spoiler alert, they kill off Optimus Prime. He's dead for like 40 minutes, and they treat him like an absolute joke. And it doesn't get any better for Megatron. So when Megatron first gets resurrected, his most badass line throughout the entire series is that, if I remember correctly, he says, "Even in death, there's no other command but mine," which is a badass thing that Megatron would absolutely say. But then quite literally, in the next scene, he's now bowing like an absolute wuss to the main antagonist of the film called the Fallen, which is a character I've never heard of. And on top of that, the Fallen is about question the worst antagonist in the entire live-action series, because once Optimus Prime gets brought back to life and gets his little booster pack update, he then completely trashes the Fallen in literally 30 seconds. So it was kind of anticlimactic. And on top of that, I connect this movie with another also terrible incident. Some of you might not even remember this, but this movie came out the day before Michael Jackson passed away. So the fact that I connect this film with the passing of a truly great man is just not a great way you want to remember this film. And I only saw this film once, and I still absolutely despise this film, which is why it well deserves being worse and the lowest spot on my list of live-action Transformers films. Taking the number 5 spot on my list has to go to Transformers The Last Knight. Now, this movie also has the problem of just having a story that has very little focus. I mean, okay, visually, yes, it still looks good. But heck, all these Transformers films to a certain point still look good, because they spent a lot of money on that. Now, the interaction between the human characters and the Transformers don't really work. The primary antagonist is very forgettable. The fact that they tried this whole storyline about Optimus Prime being corrupted by, I believe, dark energon, which makes him be evil, was something that had been done in previous stories far superior. And it was just too much. I mean, there is a point where there has to be some level of focus. And the fact that this movie is like an adrenaline, just steroid drive from beginning to end, and gives you very little time to breathe, make this just an exhausting film to get through. And once I was done with it, I was just there's almost nothing about this film that really works. I mean, even the action set pieces, despite being visually impressive, were just a little bit too much. And they even have this very stupid scene by the end where Bumblebee gets his voice back, and Optimus Prime goes into this little speech saying, "Oh my God, Bumblebee, I haven't heard you talk in 1,000 years or something," despite the fact that I'm assuming this is supposed to be connected to the Bay films, and at the end of the first film, Bumblebee was talking. So I guess Optimus Prime might have some brain damage or some short-term memory, but just that scene in general just didn't work because it seemed to forget its own continuity. And that's something that happens a lot throughout this film. And they even tried to connect it with, like, Merlin saying how, Transformers were like Knights of the Round Table or some aspect. It just didn't work. If you're gonna do a Transformers film, don't try to connect it to key events or myths or things like that. It just muddle things. And overall, it just wasn't a very fun film to watch, which is why Transformers The Last Knight is going to have to take the number 5 spot on my list. Taking the number 4 spot on my list has to go to Transformers Age of Extinction. Now, this was kind of the beginning of a new tone, I would say, after the events of Dark of the Moon, which I'll talk about later on in the film. And this was kind of the introduction of Marky Mark being introduced to the franchise. And I would suggest the tone of films, it kind of improved because now the humans don't trust the Autobots at all, and so they're kind of on the run. And so I give the film a lot of credit for at least telling a different type of story that hadn't been told up to this point, that added a lot of elements that I think worked relatively well. I like the introduction of Galvatron, which is, for those of you that I believe it's called Galvatron, is kind of like this evolutionary form of Megatron, which I thought was pretty cool. I thought the introduction of the Dinobots was really awesome, as that kind of connects to probably one of my favorite story arcs in Transformers history. So I thought the introduction of them was also really well handled. And personally, I think that the human interactions this time around were not... they were still pretty bad, and there was a lot of just unnecessary product placement, and I think the film was too long, but I think that when this film was hitting on all notes, I thought it worked extremely well. And at least this film at least was entertaining. It wasn't great, but when it was entertaining, it was generally entertaining, and I had some moments where I generally did have fun, and that's something that I absolutely cannot say about The Last Knight, and especially Revenge of the Fallen. So at least Age of Extinction got some real serious credibility, at least for something that I thought was watchable, which is why I have no problem giving it the number 4 spot on my list. Now, number 3 is going to surprise a lot of people, because I know that a lot of people would consider this to be the best Transformers film, and it's even gotten universal praise across the board, and I perfectly understand why. But sadly, I have to give a number 3 spot to Bumblebee. Now, look, without question, I think that Bumblebee is probably the best made Transformer themed film. I think that the interaction between the Transformers and the humans is actually best here. I think it has the most heart. It actually does a very, very impressive job of actually showing us the Battle of Cybertron, which is probably my favorite scene out of any Transformers film. Just that one section alone was exactly what I had wanted to see since I was a kid, because not only does that tie perfectly with older cartoons, that ties it very perfectly. It feels like it was ripped right out of the 2 greatest Transformers games. Like, that entire atmosphere, if they had been able to make a whole film in that atmosphere, it easily could have been one of my all-time favorite films of all time. But obviously it would have probably been too expensive. But just the fact that we got to actually see the Battle of Cybertron, a bit of it, was just absolutely amazing. My biggest problem with Bumblebee, just in general, because I know that a lot of people love this film, is that it's centered around a character I'm just not a fan of. I'm sorry, I'm just not a fan of Bumblebee. It comes down to that. I wouldn't even say Bumblebee would even be one of my top 5 favorite Autobots, or hell, even top 10 favorite Transformers in the entire history of Transformers. I'm just generally not a fan of Bumblebee. And I would say that the action set pieces, despite them being, I would say, better filmed and more competent, they just didn't excite me as prior films or even later films. Not really later films, but certainly later films. But I would say that despite it being an overall better film overall, it just felt very tame. At least in other films, despite their flaws, when they hit their highs, they're significantly higher than anything that this one was able to pull. It seems like out of all the Transformers films, this one was definitely the more competent and more stable. And therefore, I think that this is still generally a good film. But I understand why people consider it to be their favorite and probably the best Transformers film. But to me, I just don't feel that way, which is why I would give it the number 3 spot on my list. Number 2 on my list is probably also going to surprise some people, but it has to actually go to Transformers Dark of the Moon. Now, I would say for the first 3 Bay films, it was kind of a weird let's see transition, because you had one film that was in one spot, and then it got considerably worse, very badly, very quickly, and then they somehow made some proper adjustments, made a few changes, add a few tones, mix some things up, and it actually managed to bounce back in a good way. And I generally really enjoyed seeing Dark of the Moon. In fact, this is probably the only Transformers film I've actually seen multiple times in theaters, and I actually paid extra to see it in 3D, which is the only Transformers film I ever did that with. Now, I absolutely liked how it managed to also show scenes of Cybertron. It actually showed you Optimus's connection to his mentor, who was Sentinel Prime, who's like that's not officially canon, but I do like how they acknowledge that. I generally did like the action set pieces. I think this film has the best soundtrack out of any of the Transformers films, and I think that without question it has probably my favorite action set pieces in the entire series. I think where it kind of starts dragging is the human characters, and that's been a consistent problem throughout the entire series, is that outside of Bumblebee, I would say, is that they can't seem to find a great way to balance having the human interactions with the Transformers, or heck, even the Decepticons. But I will say that out of all the Transformers films, this one, I think, despite having some problems, is quite enjoyable. And, I have fun with it. And trust me, at the end of the day, despite how some people may feel about certain films, having fun with it is what matters the most. And I did have fun with Dark of the Moon, which is why I give it the number 2 spot on my list. But there can only be one top film, and without question, which still remains to this day, my favorite live-action Transformers film has to be the first one. Now, the advantage that, to me, the first one has is that it ultimately set the tone for the rest of the series. Now, I openly acknowledge that there are some problems in terms of, character performances and, comedy decisions and lore issues. However, the fact that it is the first one doesn't hurt as much, because these are mistakes that can be fixed, or unfortunately in some later installments got considerably worse. But I really did like the interactions. I did like the story they were telling. I did like how it explained the history. This is the one where I think the human characters, it was almost kind of necessary, because for most of the Transformers mythology, humans don't play a big role. But this is the only one where I felt like you kind of have to have that human contributing, and I thought that was great. I actually love the action set pieces. It's not my favorite of the entire series. That has to go to Dark of the Moon, but this kind of set the standards, and I think visually it allowed me to see things that I had never seen before. I mean, trust me, that first shot of seeing the Autobots gather together is just an impressive shot. And out of all the Transformers films, this is the only one where I can actually name all the Transformers. It's the only one. Like, if you were to ask me, like, which Transformers were in the other films, I have a hard time remembering, but this is the only one where I can properly identify them. And that's harder to do for the Decepticons, because they kind of look like a mishmash of junk that some people will say, but no, I had no problems with that. And I actually think that the performances from, Shia LaBeouf was actually decent. I think Megan Fox, not a great actress at this point, because I think this was like the first time I saw her in, wasn't all that bad. She was just there for eye candy, and I think she did her role. I think that, the other human characters did a very good job, and it's still, to this day, it's probably the one I've seen the most amount of times. So, yeah, to this day, which is why I would still consider it, personally, my favorite live-action Transformer film of all time, to this day, still. So that about does it for my personal ranking of the live-action Transformers films. Now, if you've seen all 6 of these films, I'd like to know, how would you rank them? Share your list with me and everyone else in the comments down below. And like always, thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I will see you all next time.